The autumn wind swept through the streets of Riverside Heights, carrying with it the crisp scent of fallen leaves and the distant promise of rain. Margaret Chen stood at the bus stop, her worn canvas bag clutched tightly against her chest, watching as the yellow school bus disappeared around the corner with her daughter Emma waving from the back window. The morning sun cast long shadows across the sidewalk, and Margaret pulled her faded cardigan closer around her thin frame, trying to ward off the chill that seemed to seep into her bones. She glanced down at her phone, checking the time for what felt like the 100th time that morning. The parent-teacher conference at Westbrook Academy was scheduled for 9 o'clock, and she had exactly 43 minutes to make it across town on public transportation. The prestigious private school had offered Emma a scholarship after recognizing her exceptional academic abilities, and today's meeting was crucial for discussing her daughter's continued enrollment. Margaret began walking toward the main bus terminal, her practical black flats scuffed at the toes and worn thin at the heels, making soft sounds against the concrete. She caught a glimpse of her reflection in a storefront window and paused for just a moment. The woman staring back at her looked tired, her dark hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, a few grey strands catching the light. Her navy blue dress, though clean and pressed, had been purchased from a thrift store 5 years ago and showed its age in the faded color and slightly frayed hemline. She remembered a time when her closet had been filled with designer clothes, when she had walked into rooms with the confidence that came from knowing she belonged. That was before Daniel's accident, before the medical bills consumed their savings, before she had to sell their house and move into the small apartment above the laundromat on 5th Street. The bus arrived with a hydraulic hiss, and Margaret climbed aboard, feeding quarters into the machine because she hadn't been able to afford a monthly pass this month. She found a seat near the back and watched the city scroll past the smudged window, her mind drifting to the letter she had received last week from Principal Victoria Ashworth. Dear Mrs. Chen, the letter had begun in crisp, impersonal font. We are pleased to inform you that Emma has been selected for our Advanced Academic Track program. Please attend the Parent-Teacher Conference on October 15th to discuss her enrollment and the expectations we have for families participating in this prestigious program. Margaret had read those words a dozen times, pride swelling in her chest each time. Emma was brilliant, there was no denying that. At 11 years old, she was already reading at a high school level, solving mathematical equations that made Margaret's head spin, and asking questions about the universe that neither Margaret nor her teachers could easily answer. The scholarship to Westbrook Academy had been a gift from heaven, an opportunity that Margaret never could have provided on her seamstress's salary. The bus lurched to a stop, and Margaret stepped off onto a tree-lined street that seemed to belong to an entirely different world. Here, the houses were grand Victorian mansions with manicured lawns and expensive cars parked in circular driveways. Westbrook Academy sat at the end of the street, its ivy-covered brick walls and wrought-iron gates announcing its exclusivity to anyone who dared approach. Margaret straightened her cardigan, lifted her chin, and began the walk toward the school's entrance. She had nothing to be ashamed of, she reminded herself. She was a good mother, a hard worker, and her daughter was thriving. That was what mattered, not the labels in her clothes or the balance in her bank account. The main building of Westbrook Academy was even more impressive up close. Marble columns flanked the entrance, and the brass handles on the heavy oak doors gleamed in the morning light. Margaret pulled one of the doors open and stepped into a foyer that smelled of furniture polish and old money. A young woman sat behind a reception desk, her blonde hair perfectly styled, her makeup flawless, her designer blouse probably costing more than Margaret earned in a week. She looked up as Margaret approached, and something flickered in her eyes, something that might have been surprise or perhaps judgment. "Good morning," Margaret said, keeping her voice steady and pleasant. "I'm here for the parent-teacher conference. My daughter is Emma Chen." The receptionist glanced at her computer screen, her manicured nails clicking against the keyboard. "Mrs. Chen, yes." She looked up again, her eyes traveling over Margaret's outfit in a way that made her skin prickle with discomfort. "The conference is in the Ashworth Hall, down the corridor, third door on your left. You're a bit early." "Thank you," Margaret replied, refusing to let the woman's subtle dismissal affect her composure. She followed the directions, her footsteps echoing in the marble corridor, lined with portraits of distinguished alumni and benefactors. The names beneath the paintings read like a who's who of industry and politics: senators, CEOs, famous physicians, celebrated artists. These walls told a story of privilege and prestige, of doors that opened easily for those born into the right families. The Ashworth Hall was a large conference room with floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked a pristine courtyard. Several parents were already seated in plush chairs, arranged in a semicircle, their attention focused on a woman standing at the front of the room. Principal Victoria Ashworth was exactly as Margaret had imagined from her formal letters and the school's website. Tall, impeccably dressed in a charcoal grey suit, her silver hair swept up in an elegant twist, her posture radiating authority and control. Margaret slipped into one of the empty chairs near the back, trying to make herself as inconspicuous as possible. The parents around her were dressed as if they had stepped out of a magazine spread. The women in designer dresses and expensive jewelry. The men in tailored suits that probably cost more than Margaret's car. She felt their eyes on her, felt the weight of their silent assessments, but she kept her gaze fixed on Principal Ashworth and reminded herself why she was here. Emma. She was here for Emma. Principal Ashworth was speaking about the Advanced Academic Track program, her voice smooth and practiced. "This program represents the very best of what Westbrook Academy has to offer. We expect not only academic excellence from our students, but also a commitment from their families to uphold the values and standards that have made this institution a beacon of achievement for over a century." Margaret listened intently, taking mental notes about the program requirements, the additional tutoring sessions, the extracurricular activities that were mandatory for participants. It was a lot to take in, and some of it worried her, particularly the mention of various fees that scholarship funds didn't cover, but she was determined to find a way to make it work. The presentation continued for another 20 minutes, and then Principal Ashworth opened the floor for questions. Several parents raised their hands, asking about college placement rates and networking opportunities and the school's connections to Ivy League admissions committees. Margaret stayed quiet, feeling increasingly out of place with each passing minute. Finally, Principal Ashworth announced that she would be meeting with each family individually to discuss their child's specific placement in the program. She would call names alphabetically, and the meetings would take place in her private office adjoining the conference room. The first few families were summoned, Andersons and Blackwells and Cartwrights, each one disappearing into the principal's office for 15 or 20 minutes before emerging with satisfied smiles. Margaret waited patiently, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes watching the courtyard where a gardener was raking leaves into neat piles. When Principal Ashworth finally called the Chen family, Margaret rose from her chair and smoothed her dress, taking a deep breath before walking toward the office door. She could feel eyes following her, could hear the whispered conversations that started as soon as she passed. Principal Ashworth's office was a study in controlled elegance, all dark wood and leather chairs and shelves lined with leather-bound books. The principal was already seated behind her massive desk, a pair of reading glasses perched on her nose as she reviewed a file, presumably Emma's. "Please, sit down, Mrs. Chen," Principal Ashworth said without looking up. Margaret took a seat in one of the chairs facing the desk, her canvas bag balanced on her knees. She waited in silence, her eyes taking in the diplomas and awards that covered the walls, the photographs of Principal Ashworth shaking hands with various important-looking people. Finally, the principal looked up, and Margaret watched as something shifted in her expression. It was subtle but unmistakable, a tightening around the eyes, a slight pursing of the lips. Principal Ashworth's gaze travelled from Margaret's face to her worn cardigan, her faded dress, her practical shoes, and then back up again. "Mrs. Chen," she began, her tone noticeably cooler than it had been during the presentation, "I have to say I'm somewhat concerned." Margaret felt her stomach tighten. Concerned about what, Principal Ashworth? Emma's grades are excellent. Her teachers have nothing but praise for her work and her attitude. Yes, the principal acknowledged, her fingers tapping against the desk. Emma is an exceptional student. There's no question about that. However, the advanced academic track is about more than just grades. It's about preparing our students and their families to move in certain circles, to represent this institution at the highest levels. "I'm not sure I understand," Margaret said slowly, though a cold suspicion was beginning to form in her mind. Principal Ashworth removed her reading glasses and set them deliberately on the desk. "Let me be direct with you, Mrs. Chen. This program involves significant interaction between families. There are events, galas, networking functions. The parents who participate are expected to contribute not just financially, but socially. They need to be the kind of people who can represent Westbrook Academy appropriately." "And you don't think I'm that kind of person?" Margaret said. It wasn't a question. The principal's smile was thin and humorless. "I think, Mrs. Chen, that there are certain realities we need to acknowledge. I've looked at your file. You're a seamstress, is that correct? Working at a dry cleaner's shop?" "I do alterations and repairs, yes," Margaret replied, her voice steady despite the anger building in her chest. "It's honest work." "I'm sure it is." Principal Ashworth leaned back in her chair, her eyes never leaving Margaret's face. "But let's be realistic. The other families in this program, they're executives, attorneys, surgeons. They have resources, connections, influence. They can open doors for their children and for the school. What exactly can you offer, Mrs. Chen?" Margaret felt as if she had been slapped. For a moment, she couldn't find words, couldn't believe that this woman was saying these things to her face without any pretense of subtlety. "I can offer my daughter," she finally managed. "Emma, who works harder than any student in this school. Emma, who stays up late studying because she knows that education is her best chance at a better life. Emma, who loves learning with a passion that puts most adults to shame. Isn't that enough?" Principal Ashworth sighed as if dealing with a particularly slow child. "Mrs. Chen, I'm trying to do you a favor here. The advanced academic track is highly competitive. The other families, frankly, won't accept someone who doesn't fit in. And you," she gestured vaguely at Margaret's outfit, "clearly don't fit in." The words hung in the air between them, ugly and undeniable. "Are you saying that my daughter can't participate in this program because I don't dress well enough?" Margaret asked, her voice dangerously quiet. "I'm saying that we have standards at Westbrook Academy, standards that extend beyond the classroom." Principal Ashworth picked up her glasses again, a clear dismissal. "Perhaps you should consider whether this school is really the right fit for your family." Margaret sat very still, her hands gripping her canvas bag so tightly that her knuckles turned white. 1,000 responses swirled through her mind, angry words and bitter truths, but she forced herself to breathe, to think, to remember why she was here. "Principal Ashworth," she said carefully, "my daughter earned her place in this school through her own merit. She earned her place in this program the same way. I refuse to believe that Westbrook Academy would discriminate against a child because her mother can't afford designer clothes." The principal's expression hardened. "What I believe, Mrs. Chen, is that you're wasting my time. This meeting is over. I have other families to attend to, families who understand and appreciate what this school has to offer." "So that's it?" Margaret stood up, her legs trembling but her voice strong. "You're kicking me out because you don't like how I look? I'm ending this meeting because it's clear that we're not going to reach an understanding." Principal Ashworth pressed a button on her desk. "Patricia, please escort Mrs. Chen out of the building." Margaret stood her ground. "You haven't heard the last of this. My daughter has rights, and I will fight for every single one of them." "Feel free to file whatever complaints you like, Mrs. Chen." The principal's smile was cold. "But I should warn you that this school has very powerful friends, very powerful indeed." The door opened, and the blonde receptionist appeared, her expression a careful mask of professional neutrality. "Mrs. Chen, if you'll follow me." Margaret looked at Principal Ashworth one last time, memorizing every detail of her smug, superior face. Then she turned and walked out of the office, her head held high despite the humiliation burning in her chest. The walk back through the corridor felt endless, each step echoing in the marble silence, each portrait seeming to stare down at her with contempt. Margaret could feel tears pricking at her eyes, but she refused to let them fall, refused to give anyone the satisfaction of seeing her cry. The receptionist led her to the main entrance without a word, holding the door open with a pointed look that said everything her mouth didn't. "Thank you," Margaret said, because she was raised to be polite even to people who didn't deserve it. She stepped out into the cool autumn air and paused on the front steps, taking a deep breath to steady herself. The morning sun had given way to clouds, and the wind had picked up, sending leaves skittering across the manicured lawn. In the distance, thunder rumbled ominously. What now? Margaret thought, clutching her canvas bag. What was she supposed to tell Emma, who had been so excited about the program, who had worked so hard to earn this opportunity? How could she explain that her mother's poverty had become a barrier that no amount of academic excellence could overcome? She was so lost in thought that she didn't notice the black car pulling up to the curb until it came to a stop directly in front of her. It was a Mercedes, sleek and expensive, with tinted windows that obscured whoever was inside. Margaret stepped aside automatically, assuming it was another wealthy parent arriving for the conference. The driver's door opened, and a man in a crisp suit stepped out, walking around to open the rear passenger door. Margaret watched, curiosity momentarily overcoming her misery, as a pair of elegant heels emerged from the car, followed by a woman in her 50s, dressed in a tailored cream-colored suit that probably cost more than Margaret's annual salary. The woman was beautiful in that ageless way that spoke of excellent genes, careful maintenance, and unlimited resources. Her auburn hair was swept back from a face that seemed familiar somehow, and she carried herself with the confident grace of someone who was used to being noticed. Margaret started to move out of the way, but the woman looked directly at her and stopped, her eyes widening in what appeared to be genuine surprise. Margaret Chen?" Margaret blinked, completely thrown. The woman's voice triggered something in her memory, a door opening to a past she had almost forgotten. "I'm sorry, do I know you?" she asked hesitantly. The woman laughed, a warm, rich sound that seemed at odds with her sophisticated appearance. "Maggie, it's me, Catherine Hawthorne. Well, Catherine Whitmore now, but back in college, we were—" "Kathy?" Margaret's jaw dropped as recognition flooded through her. "Kathy Hawthorne! Oh my God!" And suddenly they were hugging, two middle-aged women on the steps of a prestigious school, laughing and crying and talking over each other like the college roommates they had been nearly 30 years ago. "I can't believe it," Catherine said, holding Margaret at arm's length to look at her. "It's been so long. I've thought about you so many times over the years, wondered what happened to you." Margaret shook her head in disbelief. "I could say the same thing. After you transferred junior year, we lost touch so completely. And now you're here, of all places." Catherine's expression softened. "My grandson goes to school here. Lucas. I'm on the board of directors, actually. I come in for these meetings a few times a year. But Margaret, what are you doing here? Do you have a child at Westbrook?" "My daughter Emma," Margaret said, and just like that the reality of the morning came crashing back. She felt her smile falter, felt the tears she had been holding back threaten to spill over. Catherine noticed immediately, her eyes sharpening with concern. "Maggie, what is it? What's wrong?" And before she could stop herself, Margaret was telling her everything. The words poured out in a flood, the story of Daniel's accident and death, of the medical bills and the lost home, of the years of struggle and sacrifice, and finally of the meeting with Principal Ashworth that had just ended in such humiliation. Catherine listened without interruption, her face growing increasingly thunderous as the story unfolded. By the time Margaret finished, her friend's elegant features had hardened into something that would have frightened Margaret if she hadn't known it wasn't directed at her. She said, "What?" Catherine's voice was dangerously quiet. "She told you that you didn't fit in because of how you're dressed?" Margaret nodded miserably. She made it very clear that families like mine aren't welcome in her precious program. That my daughter's academic achievements don't matter because I can't afford designer clothes and don't have the right connections. Catherine was silent for a long moment, her jaw tight, her eyes like blue fire. Then she turned to her driver, who had been standing discreetly by the car. "James, please wait here. I'm going to be a while." "Yes, Mrs. Whitmore." Catherine took Margaret's arm with gentle firmness. "Come with me, Maggie. I think it's time I introduced myself to your daughter's principal." "Kathy, you don't have to." "I know I don't have to." Catherine's smile was sharp as a blade. "But I want to very much." They walked back up the steps together through the heavy oak doors, past the reception desk where the blonde woman's eyes went wide with recognition and something that looked very much like fear. "Mrs. Whitmore," she exclaimed, jumping to her feet, "we weren't expecting you today." "Clearly not," Catherine replied, her tone pleasant but her eyes cold. "Where is Principal Ashworth? I'd like a word with her." "She's in her office, meeting with parents, but I can—" "Thank you, Patricia. I'll show myself in." Margaret followed Catherine through the marble corridor, watching in amazement as her old friend moved through the school with the easy confidence of someone who owned the place, which, Margaret was beginning to realize, she very nearly did. The door to Principal Ashworth's office was closed, but Catherine didn't bother to knock. She pushed it open and strode in, Margaret trailing behind her to find the principal mid-sentence with another set of parents. Principal Ashworth's face went through a remarkable transformation in the span of about 2 seconds, from irritation at the interruption to shock, and then to something that looked very much like panic. "Mrs. Whitmore." She stood up so quickly that her chair rolled backward and hit the wall. "I had no idea you were planning to visit today." Catherine's smile didn't reach her eyes. "Neither did I, but something's come up that requires immediate attention." She turned to the startled parents sitting across from the principal. "I apologize for the interruption. Would you mind giving us a few minutes? I promise this won't take long." The parents, clearly recognizing someone of significant importance, gathered their things and hurried out without a word. Margaret remained standing just inside the door, feeling like she had stepped into a completely different reality. "Principal Ashworth," Catherine said, settling herself into one of the chairs with the ease of someone who was used to being in charge. "I believe you've already met my friend Margaret Chen." The principal's eyes darted to Margaret, and the blood drained from her face. "Your friend?" "Yes, my friend. We were roommates at Stanford, actually. Lost touch over the years, as sometimes happens with old friends, but we've just been catching up. She told me the most fascinating story about a meeting she had with you this morning." Principal Ashworth's mouth opened and closed several times, like a fish gasping for air. "Mrs. Whitmore, I can explain." "Or can you?" Catherine leaned forward, her voice still pleasant but carrying an edge that made the principal flinch. "Can you explain why you told a mother that her daughter, who by all accounts is one of the most brilliant students in this school, isn't welcome in the advanced academic track because her mother doesn't dress well enough?" That's a mischaracterization of what I said." "Is it?" Catherine tilted her head. "Margaret, what exactly did Principal Ashworth say to you?" Margaret stepped forward, finding her voice at last. "She said that I don't fit in, that the other families won't accept someone like me. She looked at my clothes and told me that this school has standards that extend beyond the classroom." Catherine nodded slowly, never taking her eyes off the principal. "And then what happened?" "She had her receptionist escort me out of the building," Margaret said. "She told me to feel free to file complaints, but warned me that the school has very powerful friends." The silence that followed was thick enough to cut with a knife. Principal Ashworth had gone from pale to grey, her hands gripping the edge of her desk as if it were the only thing keeping her upright. "Very powerful friends," Catherine repeated softly. "That's interesting, Victoria. Do you know what else is interesting? The fact that my family has donated over $12 million to this school over the past 20 years. The fact that I personally endowed the scholarship program that made it possible for Emma Chen to attend Westbrook Academy in the first place. The fact that I sit on the board of directors and have the ability to call an emergency meeting at any time to discuss matters of concern." Principal Ashworth looked like she might be sick. "Mrs. Whitmore, please. This is all a misunderstanding. I was simply trying to explain to Mrs. Chen that the advanced academic track requires certain commitments from families." "Commitments like wearing designer clothes?" Catherine's voice cracked like a whip. "Commitments like being wealthy enough to attend galas and make donations? Because that's not what I remember discussing when we established this program, Victoria. I remember discussing academic excellence. I remember discussing opportunity for deserving students. I don't remember discussing dress codes for parents." The principal was shaking now, her carefully maintained composure crumbling before their eyes. "I never meant to imply." "You did more than imply. You explicitly told a grieving widow, a woman who has struggled and sacrificed to give her daughter every possible opportunity, that she wasn't good enough for your school because she couldn't afford fancy clothes." Catherine stood up, and though she was shorter than the principal, she somehow seemed to tower over her. "You represent everything I've spent my life fighting against, Victoria. The assumption that wealth equals worth. The belief that appearance matters more than substance. The absolute blindness to the fact that some of the most brilliant, hard-working, valuable people in this world don't have access to the privileges that others take for granted." Principal Ashworth's eyes were filling with tears. "Mrs. Whitmore, please. I've dedicated my entire career to this school." "And you've done some good work," Catherine acknowledged. "But this incident has shown me something deeply troubling about your leadership, something that goes beyond a single bad decision." She pulled out her phone and began typing. "I'm calling an emergency board meeting for tomorrow morning. We'll be discussing your position here at Westbrook Academy." No, the principal's professional mask shattered completely. "Please, Mrs. Whitmore, my career, my reputation, I'll do anything." "Anything?" Catherine paused her typing. "Then start by apologizing to Margaret. A real apology, not the kind of political non-apology that people in your position usually offer." Principal Ashworth turned to Margaret, her face a mess of mascara and desperation. "Mrs. Chen, I am so sorry. I was wrong, completely wrong. I judged you unfairly and I said things that were cruel and unacceptable. Please, please forgive me." Margaret looked at this woman who had made her feel so small just an hour ago, and she felt something unexpected. Pity. Principal Ashworth, stripped of her authority and her certainty, was just another human being, flawed and frightened and desperately trying to hold on to what she had. "I accept your apology," Margaret said quietly, "but I need you to understand something. My daughter is brilliant and hard-working and deserving of every opportunity this school can offer her. She should never, ever be made to feel less than because of where she comes from or what her mother can afford. No child should." "You're absolutely right." Principal Ashworth wiped her eyes with shaking hands. "I promise you, Mrs. Chen, Emma will receive every opportunity available to her." I'll personally ensure it." Catherine put her phone away, though her expression remained stern. "I'm glad to hear that, Victoria. I'm still going to have a conversation with the board about what happened here today, but perhaps we can frame it as a learning experience rather than a termination hearing. Assuming, of course, that I see real changes in how this school treats families like Margaret's." "Yes, of course," the principal said, nodding vigorously. "I'll implement new training programs, sensitivity workshops. I'll personally review all our admissions and program policies." "Good." Catherine turned to Margaret and smiled warmly. "Now how about we get out of here and have some coffee? I want to hear everything about your life, your daughter, all of it. We have nearly 30 years of catching up to do." They left the principal's office together, arm in arm, leaving Victoria Ashworth standing among the ruins of her assumptions and prejudices. As they walked through the marble corridor, past the portraits of distinguished alumni, Margaret felt something she hadn't felt in years: hope. "Kathy," she said as they stepped out into the autumn air, "I don't know how to thank you." Catherine squeezed her arm. "You don't need to thank me, Maggie. You stood up for yourself and your daughter in there, even when you were alone and outnumbered and facing someone who had all the power. That takes courage. I just happened to show up at the right moment to add some reinforcement." "Still," Margaret said, "if you hadn't been there." "But I was there. That's what matters." Catherine guided her toward the waiting Mercedes. "Now let me tell you something about myself that I don't share with many people. 25 years ago, I married into the Whitmore family. Old money, old connections, old everything. And for the first 10 years of that marriage, I felt exactly like you did in that office. Like an imposter. Like I didn't belong. Like people were constantly judging me for not being good enough." "What changed?" Margaret asked. "I realized that their opinion of me only mattered if I let it matter." Catherine opened the car door for her. "I realized that my worth wasn't determined by their approval. I started speaking up, pushing back, using my position to help people who reminded me of who I used to be. And you know what I found? The people who are worth knowing, the ones who matter, they respect that. It's only the small-minded, insecure ones who try to tear others down." They settled into the plush leather seats of the Mercedes, and the driver pulled smoothly away from the school. Margaret watched the ivy-covered walls recede in the rear window, thinking about everything that had happened. "Emma is going to be so excited," she said, "about the program, I mean, and about meeting you. She's heard me talk about my college roommate so many times." "I can't wait to meet her," Catherine said warmly. "But Maggie, there's something else I want to discuss with you, something that's been on my mind since you told me about Daniel." Margaret tensed slightly. "What about him?" Catherine reached over and took her hand. "You mentioned the medical bills, the financial struggle. I know you're proud, Maggie. I remember that about you. You never wanted to accept help from anyone. But I want you to know that I'm in a position now to help, and I would consider it an honor if you'd let me." "Kathy, I can't." "Hear me out." Catherine's grip tightened gently. "I'm not talking about charity. I'm talking about an investment. An investment in Emma's future and in yours. I sit on the boards of several companies, including one that desperately needs someone with your skills." "My skills?" Margaret laughed incredulously. "I'm a seamstress, Kathy. I fix hems and repair buttons." "You're a master craftsman," Catherine corrected. "Don't think I didn't notice the alterations on that dress you're wearing. The darts, the taken-in waist, the adjusted hem. You did that yourself, didn't you?" Margaret looked down at her faded navy dress. "Yes, but the fashion industry is worth billions of dollars, Maggie. And do you know what the biggest trend right now is? Sustainability. Repairing, altering, upcycling existing clothes instead of buying new ones. I know a designer who's launching a new line built entirely around that concept, and she needs someone who can actually do the work. Someone who understands fabric and construction and how to make old things new again." Margaret stared at her friend, hardly daring to believe what she was hearing. "Are you serious?" Completely serious. The starting salary is $80,000 a year, with full benefits and opportunities for advancement. Catherine smiled at the stunned expression on Margaret's face. Think about it. Talk it over with Emma. But don't say no, just because you're afraid of accepting help. Sometimes the universe puts people back in our lives for a reason. The car glided through the streets of Riverside Heights, past the grand Victorian mansions and the manicured lawns, toward the coffee shop where two old friends would spend the afternoon reconnecting. Margaret watched the city pass by and felt for the first time in years like maybe the universe wasn't against her after all. 3 weeks later, Margaret stood in front of her bathroom mirror, adjusting the collar of her new blouse. It wasn't designer, but it was quality, purchased with her first paycheck from her new job at Elena Marchetti's sustainable fashion studio. The work was challenging and fulfilling, and Eleanor had been so impressed with Margaret's skills that she was already talking about making her a partner in the business. "Mum, you look great." Emma appeared in the doorway, her dark hair pulled back in a ponytail that mirrored her mother's. "Are you nervous about tonight?" Margaret smiled at her daughter's reflection. "A little. It's been a long time since I've been to anything like a gala." The Westbrook Academy Fall Gala was the social event of the season, and Margaret had received a personal invitation from Catherine Whitmore, who was being honored for her contributions to the school's scholarship program. It would be Margaret's first appearance at the kind of event she had been told she wasn't good enough to attend. "Do you think Principal Ashworth will be there?" Emma asked, a mischievous glint in her eye. "Probably," Margaret said. "She's still the principal, after all." The board had decided not to fire Victoria Ashworth, largely due to Catherine's intervention on her behalf. Instead, the principal had been required to implement a comprehensive diversity and inclusion program, attend sensitivity training, and personally apologize to every family who had ever felt discriminated against by the school's administration. By all accounts, she had taken the lessons to heart and was working hard to change not just her behavior, but her entire worldview. "I think she's actually becoming a better person," Emma said thoughtfully. "She came to talk to our class last week about empathy and treating people with respect. She seemed really genuine." "People can change," Margaret said, turning to face her daughter. "Sometimes it takes a wake-up call, but people can change." The doorbell rang, and Emma's face lit up. "That's Aunt Kathy." It had become Emma's name for Catherine over the past few weeks, as the older woman had taken every opportunity to spend time with her friend's remarkable daughter. She had become a mentor to Emma, sharing stories of her own path from working-class scholarship student to influential philanthropist, showing her that success didn't have to mean abandoning where you came from. Margaret opened the door to find Catherine standing there in an elegant emerald gown, her smile as warm as ever. "Are my two favorite people ready for a night out?" The gala was held in Westbrook Academy's grand ballroom, a space that Margaret had never seen before, despite her daughter attending the school for over a year. Crystal chandeliers cast sparkling light over the crowd of well-dressed parents and donors, while waiters circulated with trays of champagne and canapes. Margaret entered on Catherine's arm, with Emma following close behind in a beautiful dress that had been a gift from her new aunt. She braced herself for the judgmental looks, the whispered comments, the subtle exclusion she had experienced at the parent-teacher conference. Instead, she found herself being approached by friendly faces, people who introduced themselves and expressed genuine interest in getting to know her. Word had apparently spread about her connection to Catherine Whitmore, but more than that, people had heard about her work with Elena Marchetti, about her skills as a designer and craftsman. Mrs. Chen, a woman in a stunning red dress, approached her, hand extended. "I'm Sophia Rodriguez. My daughter is in Emma's class. I've been hearing so much about your work in sustainable fashion. I would love to talk to you about possibly doing some alterations on some of my vintage pieces." "I'd be happy to," Margaret said, genuinely surprised. "Let me give you my card." The evening continued in much the same way, with Margaret finding herself drawn into conversations about fashion, sustainability, education, and a dozen other topics. She discovered that many of the parents she had assumed were shallow and judgmental were actually thoughtful, interesting people who had simply never had the opportunity to know her. At one point, she found herself standing face to face with Principal Victoria Ashworth. The principal looked different somehow, less rigid, more human. Her eyes held none of the cold judgment they had contained at their first meeting. "Mrs. Chen," Principal Ashworth said, extending her hand, "I'm so glad you came tonight." Margaret shook her hand. "Thank you for inviting me." "I need to apologize to you again," the principal said quietly. "What I said to you that day, how I treated you, it was inexcusable. I've spent the past few weeks doing a lot of soul-searching, and I've realized that I had allowed my own insecurities and prejudices to blind me to what really matters." "What made you change?" Margaret asked, genuinely curious. Principal Ashworth smiled ruefully. "Honestly, watching your daughter, Emma is one of the most remarkable students I've ever encountered. She's brilliant, yes, but she's also kind, compassionate, and completely unimpressed by all the things I used to think were important. Wealth, status, connections, none of it matters to her. She judges people by their character, not their clothes or their bank accounts. And I realized that an 11-year-old girl was showing me what leadership really looks like." Margaret felt tears prickling at her eyes. "She's a special kid. She has a special mother." Principal Ashworth glanced across the room to where Catherine was accepting an award, and apparently a special family friend. "Mrs. Whitmore has been very generous in her forgiveness of me. I'm not sure I would have been so kind if our positions were reversed." "People can change," Margaret said, echoing what she had told Emma earlier, "and second chances are valuable. I think Mrs. Whitmore understands that." The principal nodded, her eyes bright with emotion. "I won't forget this lesson, Mrs. Chen. I promise you that." They parted ways, and Margaret made her way over to Catherine, who had just finished her acceptance speech and was being surrounded by well-wishers. She caught Margaret's eye and excused herself, pulling her friend aside. "How are you holding up?" Catherine asked. "Better than I expected," Margaret admitted. "People are being so friendly. I keep waiting for the other shoe to drop." Catherine laughed. "Maggie, the other shoe dropped 3 weeks ago when you walked into that school and refused to be diminished by a small-minded principal. Everything since then has been your reward for having the courage to stand your ground." "I didn't stand my ground alone. You showed up at exactly the right moment. That's what friends are for." Catherine squeezed her hand. "And speaking of timing, I have something for you. A little gift to celebrate your new job and your triumphant return to Westbrook Academy." She pressed a small velvet box into Margaret's hand. Inside was a delicate gold necklace with a charm shaped like a needle and thread, tiny diamonds glinting in the eye of the needle. "Kathy, it's beautiful," Margaret breathed. "It's a reminder," Catherine said. "A reminder that the work you do with your hands has value, that skill and dedication and craftsmanship matter, that you, Margaret Chen, are exactly enough, just as you are." Margaret hugged her friend tightly, not caring who was watching or what they might think. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything." The rest of the evening passed in a blur of conversation and laughter and new connections. At one point, Emma rushed over, her face flushed with excitement. "Mom, guess what? Lucas Whitmore asked me to dance." Margaret exchanged an amused glance with Catherine. "Did he now?" "He said his grandmother told him I was the smartest girl in the school and he should get to know me." Emma rolled her eyes good-naturedly. "Grandmothers, right?" They watched as Emma returned to the dance floor, where a shy-looking boy with Catherine's auburn hair was waiting for her. "She's going to change the world someday," Catherine said softly. "I know," Margaret replied, "and I'm going to make sure she has every opportunity to do it." It was nearly midnight when Margaret finally gathered Emma and said their goodbyes. Catherine walked them to the door, where the Mercedes was waiting to take them home. "Same time next week for dinner?" Catherine asked. "Wouldn't miss it," Margaret said, "and Kathy, thank you. Not just for tonight, but for everything, for believing in me when I had stopped believing in myself." Catherine smiled, her eyes shining. "That's what the best friends do, Maggie. Now get some sleep. You have a lot of beautiful things to create tomorrow." The drive home was quiet. Both Margaret and Emma lost in their own thoughts. The city lights streamed past the windows, and Margaret found herself reflecting on how much had changed in such a short time. A month ago, she had been a struggling seamstress, barely able to keep her head above water, worried about her daughter's future and her own ability to provide for it. Now, she had a career she loved, friends who valued her, and a renewed sense of hope for what was possible. Not because she had changed who she was, but because she had found people who could see her true worth. "Mom," Emma's voice broke the silence. "Yes, sweetheart?" "What you said to Principal Ashworth that day, about standing up for me, about fighting for my rights, I never thanked you for that." Margaret reached over and took her daughter's hand. "You don't have to thank me, Emma. That's what mothers do." "I know, but still." Emma squeezed her hand. "It was really brave, and it showed me that it's okay to stand up for yourself, even when the people you're standing up to seem more powerful than you." Margaret smiled, remembering her own fear and determination in that office. "No one is more powerful than someone who knows their own worth," she said. "Remember that, Emma. Never let anyone make you feel less than what you are." The car pulled up in front of their apartment building, and Margaret looked up at the windows of their small home. It wasn't much, but it was theirs, and it was filled with love. "Mom," Emma said as they climbed the stairs. "Yes? Do you think Dad would be proud of us?" Margaret paused on the landing, her heart clenching with the familiar mixture of grief and love that thoughts of Daniel always brought. "I think," she said slowly, "that your father would be incredibly proud of you for being the amazing young woman you're becoming, and of us for finding our way forward even when everything seemed impossible." They entered the apartment together, and Margaret switched on the lights, revealing the modest but cozy space they called home. On the mantel above the electric fireplace, a photograph of Daniel smiled out at them, his eyes full of the warmth and humor that Margaret still missed every single day. "I love you, Dad," Emma whispered to the photograph before heading to her room to change. Margaret stood alone in the living room, looking at her husband's face. "We did it, Daniel," she said softly. "We're going to be okay." 6 months later, Margaret stood in the showroom of Marchetti and Chen Sustainable Fashion, surrounded by racks of beautifully restored and reimagined garments. The grand opening had been a tremendous success, with celebrities, fashion influencers, and environmental activists all showing up to support the new venture. Elena Marchetti, her business partner, appeared at her elbow with a glass of champagne. "Can you believe this turnout? Every piece from the spring collection has been pre-ordered. We're going to have to hire more craftspeople just to keep up with demand." Margaret smiled, still somewhat in disbelief at how far she had come. "I never imagined any of this," she admitted. "That's because you were too busy surviving to dream." Elena clinked her glass against Margaret's. "But now you have the luxury of dreaming, and look what you've created." Across the room, Catherine was chatting with a group of fashion journalists, no doubt extolling the virtues of sustainable design and the brilliant woman who had made it all possible. She caught Margaret's eye and raised her glass in a silent toast. Emma, who had been given the afternoon off from school to attend the opening, came running over. "Mom, there's a woman from Vogue who wants to interview you." "Vogue?" Margaret laughed at her daughter's excitement. "Tell her I'll be right there." As she made her way through the crowd, accepting congratulations and business cards and invitations to speak at various events, Margaret found herself thinking about the morning she had stood on the steps of Westbrook Academy, humiliated and alone. If someone had told her then that in 6 months she would be the co-owner of a successful fashion studio, featured in magazines and respected in an industry she had only ever admired from afar, she would have laughed in disbelief. But that was before Catherine, before she had remembered that she was worthy of success, of respect, of dreams. Mrs. Chen, a young woman with a press badge, appeared at her elbow. "I'm from the local news. We're doing a story on successful women entrepreneurs. Would you mind answering a few questions?" "I'd be happy to," Margaret said. The journalist pulled out her recorder. "Can you tell me about your journey? How did you go from being a seamstress to owning one of the most talked-about fashion studios in the city?" Margaret thought for a moment, considering how to condense years of struggle and growth into a soundbite. "I think the most important thing I learned," she finally said, "is that your circumstances don't define your worth. I spent years believing that because I didn't have money or connections or the right clothes, I somehow mattered less than people who did. It took some hard lessons and some good friends to remind me that skills, character, and determination are worth more than any designer label." "That's beautiful," the journalist said. "Is there any advice you would give to other women who might be in similar situations?" Margaret looked across the room at her daughter, who was animatedly explaining sustainable fashion to a group of interested adults. "Never let anyone make you feel small," she said firmly. "Not a boss, not a principal, not a society that values appearance over substance. You are enough, exactly as you are. And the people who can't see that aren't worth your time or your tears." The interview continued, but Margaret's mind was elsewhere, thinking about all the women out there who were facing their own Victoria Ashworths, their own moments of being judged and found wanting. She made a mental note to talk to Catherine about starting a scholarship fund, not just for students, but for women trying to rebuild their lives, to find their way back to their dreams. Because if there was one thing Margaret had learned, it was that everyone deserved a second chance, and sometimes all it took was one person believing in you to change everything. The party continued late into the evening, and by the time Margaret finally locked up the showroom and headed home with Emma, she was exhausted but happy in a way she hadn't been in years. "That was amazing," Emma said as they walked through the quiet streets. "I'm so proud of you, Mom." Margaret put her arm around her daughter's shoulders. "I'm proud of us, sweetheart. We've come a long way." "Do you think Aunt Kathy will come to dinner tomorrow?" Emma asked. "I'm sure she will. She never misses a chance to spend time with her favorite goddaughter." Emma grinned. "I'm her only goddaughter." "Which makes you her favorite by default." They laughed together, the sound echoing in the cool night air. Above them, the stars were beginning to appear, tiny points of light in the vast darkness. "Mom," Emma said as they approached their apartment building. "Yes?" "I want to help other kids like me, kids who get scholarships but feel like they don't belong. I want to start a club at school, a support group or something. Do you think that would be okay?" Margaret felt her heart swell with pride. "I think that would be wonderful, Emma. I think that's exactly the kind of leader you were meant to be." "Principal Ashworth said she would help," Emma continued. "She said she wants to make sure no student ever feels the way you did at that meeting. She's really changed, Mom. I think she means it." "I think she does too." They climbed the stairs to their apartment, and Margaret paused at the door, looking back at the city lights twinkling in the distance. "You know," she said thoughtfully, "a year ago I was dreading every day. I was exhausted and scared and couldn't see any way forward. And now look at us." "What changed?" Emma asked. Margaret smiled, thinking of Catherine, of Elena, of all the unexpected friendships and opportunities that had come her way. "I stopped being afraid to ask for help," she said. "I stopped believing that I had to do everything alone, and I started believing that I deserved good things." Emma hugged her mother tightly. "You do deserve good things, Mom, the best things." "So do you, sweetheart, so do you." They went inside together, and Margaret made hot chocolate while Emma did her homework at the kitchen table. It was a simple, ordinary evening, the kind that Margaret had once taken for granted and now treasured beyond measure. Later, after Emma had gone to bed, Margaret sat by the window with a cup of tea, looking out at the night sky. She thought about Daniel, about the life they had planned together, and the future she was building without him. "I wish you could see her, Daniel," she whispered to the darkness. "She's becoming everything we hoped she would be, strong and kind and brave." A shooting star streaked across the sky, a brief flash of light against the infinite darkness. Margaret smiled and went to bed, ready for whatever tomorrow would bring. 1 year after the incident at Westbrook Academy, Margaret received an invitation that made her laugh out loud. "You're not going to believe this," she said to Catherine over lunch at their favorite cafe. "Try me," Catherine replied, raising an eyebrow. Margaret handed over the embossed card. "Principal Victoria Ashworth requests the honor of your presence at the first annual Westbrook Academy Diversity Gala, dedicated to celebrating families of all backgrounds and circumstances." Catherine read it twice, a slow smile spreading across her face. "Well, I'll be damned." "She wants me to be the keynote speaker," Margaret said, still hardly believing it. "Me! The woman she kicked out of her office a year ago." "That's poetic justice if I've ever seen it." Catherine handed back the invitation. "Are you going to do it?" Margaret considered for a moment. "Yes," she finally said. "Yes, I think I am. Not because I have anything to prove, but because maybe my story can help someone else. Maybe some other mother sitting in that audience needs to hear that it gets better." "That's very gracious of you, Maggie." Margaret shrugged. "Life's too short for grudges. Besides, Victoria has really changed. She's become one of Emma's biggest advocates. She wrote her a recommendation letter for that summer science program at MIT. People really can change," Catherine mused, "when they want to. When they're given the chance." Margaret sipped her coffee. "Speaking of chances, I have some news." "Oh?" "Elena and I have been offered a partnership with a major sustainable fashion brand. They want to take our model national, maybe even international eventually." Catherine's face lit up with genuine joy. "Maggie, that's incredible." "It feels surreal. A year ago I was worried about making rent. Now I'm being asked to help reshape an entire industry. You've worked hard for this. You deserve every bit of success that comes your way." Margaret reached across the table and squeezed her friend's hand. "I couldn't have done any of it without you, Kathy. You believed in me when I had stopped believing in myself." Catherine's eyes were suspiciously bright. "That's what friends are for, Maggie. And besides, you did all the hard work. I just opened a few doors. You're the one who walked through them." The gala was held on a crisp autumn evening, exactly 1 year after Margaret's humiliating encounter with Principal Ashworth. The school's ballroom had been transformed with banners celebrating diversity and inclusion, and the guest list included families from every economic background, every ethnicity, every walk of life. Margaret stood backstage, reviewing her notes, her heart pounding with nervous energy. Emma appeared at her side, looking beautiful in a dress they had designed together. "You're going to be great, Mum," she said confidently. "What if I forget everything I want to say?" "Then you'll speak from the heart. That's always better anyway." Margaret hugged her daughter tightly. "When did you get so wise?" Emma grinned. "I learned from watching you." From the stage, Principal Ashworth's voice echoed through the ballroom. "And now I am honored to introduce our keynote speaker. 1 year ago, I made a terrible mistake. I judged this woman by her appearance and found her wanting. I dismissed her worth because she didn't fit my narrow definition of success. I was wrong, and I have spent the past year trying to make amends for that wrongdoing." Margaret listened, her throat tight with emotion. "But what I've learned," the principal continued, "is that true worth cannot be measured by clothes or bank accounts or social connections. True worth is measured by character, by perseverance, by the courage to stand up for yourself and your children even when the odds seem impossible. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Margaret Chen." Margaret walked onto the stage to thunderous applause. She looked out at the sea of faces, at the wealthy donors in designer gowns and the scholarship families in their Sunday best, all sitting together, all equal in this moment. She found Catherine in the front row, smiling proudly. She found Emma giving her a thumbs up. She even found Principal Ashworth watching with an expression of genuine respect. 1 year ago, Margaret began, her voice steady and clear, I stood in this school and was told I wasn't good enough. Not because of anything I had done or said, but because of how I looked, how much money I had, what circles I moved in. I was made to feel small and worthless and ashamed. The room was absolutely silent, every eye fixed on her. I went home that day, convinced that the world was against me, that no matter how hard I worked, how much I sacrificed, how brilliant my daughter was, we would never be accepted by people who had more than us. I was ready to give up. She paused, letting the words sink in. But then something unexpected happened. An old friend appeared at exactly the right moment. She reminded me of something I had forgotten, that my worth is not determined by other people's opinions of me, that my skills, my character, my love for my daughter, these things have value that no amount of money can buy or lack of money can diminish. Margaret looked directly at Catherine, who was dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief. In the year since that day, my life has changed in ways I never could have imagined. I've built a successful business. I've made new friends and reconnected with old ones. I've watched my daughter thrive in an environment that now supports and celebrates her, rather than merely tolerating her presence. And I've learned that the best revenge against people who try to make you feel small is to live a big, bold, beautiful life. Applause rippled through the audience, but Margaret held up her hand. But I'm not here to talk about revenge, she said. I'm here to talk about forgiveness and growth and second chances. The woman who dismissed me a year ago is not the same woman standing on this stage tonight. Principal Ashworth has worked tirelessly to transform this school into a place where every family is welcome, where every child is valued, where appearance matters less than character. She made a mistake, yes, but she owned that mistake, learned from it, and dedicated herself to doing better. That, to me, is the definition of true leadership. Principal Ashworth's face crumpled with emotion, and she mouthed the words, "Thank you." So here is my message to you tonight, Margaret continued. To the parents who have wealth and privilege, use your power to lift others up, not to keep them down. Open doors instead of closing them. Look beyond the surface to the substance underneath. You might be surprised by what you find. She turned her gaze to the other side of the room. And to the parents who are struggling, who feel like they don't belong, who wonder if their sacrifices will ever be enough, you are enough, just as you are. Your love for your children is worth more than any designer label. Your determination to give them a better life is worth more than any trust fund. Don't let anyone make you feel otherwise. The applause that followed was deafening. People rose to their feet, tears streaming down their faces, moved by words that spoke to something deep within all of them. Margaret stepped down from the podium and was immediately surrounded by people wanting to shake her hand, to thank her, to share their own stories of struggle and triumph. She accepted each interaction with grace, but her eyes kept searching the crowd. Finally, she found who she was looking for. Catherine and Emma were waiting by the exit, both beaming with pride. "You were amazing," Emma said, throwing her arms around her mother. "I had good inspiration," Margaret replied, pulling Catherine into the embrace. The three of them stood there for a long moment, holding each other, a family forged not by blood, but by something stronger, love, loyalty, and the willingness to show up for each other when it mattered most. "So," Catherine said finally, breaking the embrace with a watery smile, "what's next for Margaret Chen, inspirational speaker and fashion mogul?" Margaret laughed. "I was thinking dinner at home with my two favorite people, some pizza, maybe a movie." "That sounds perfect," Emma said. It really does, Catherine agreed. They walked out into the cool autumn night, 3 generations of strong women, their futures bright with possibility. Behind them, Westbrook Academy glowed with warmth and light. A changed place, a better place. Margaret looked up at the stars, thinking of Daniel, of the journey that had brought her here, of all the obstacles she had overcome. "We made it," she whispered to the sky. "We really made it." And somewhere in the vast universe, she could have sworn she heard him answer, "I never doubted you for a second." 2 years after the incident that changed everything, Margaret stood in front of a mirror in her new bedroom, adjusting the collar of a beautiful silk blouse. The woman looking back at her was almost unrecognizable from the tired, defeated person who had once been escorted out of a principal's office. Her hair was styled in an elegant bob, her face showing the healthy glow of someone who was eating well, sleeping well, and living a life filled with purpose. The dark circles that had once seemed permanent were gone, replaced by smile lines that spoke of genuine happiness. "Mom!" Emma's voice echoed from downstairs. "Aunt Kathy's here!" Margaret took one last look at her reflection, smiled, and went downstairs to greet her friend. The house was new. A charming Victorian in a good neighborhood, purchased with the proceeds from Marchetti and Chen's expansion into 3 new cities. It wasn't a mansion by any means, but it was theirs, filled with books and art, and the comfortable chaos of a home where people actually lived. Catherine was sitting in the living room with Emma, the 2 of them poring over a brochure for a summer leadership program at Stanford University. "She got in!" Catherine announced as Margaret entered. "Full scholarship!" Margaret felt her heart swell with pride. "Emma, that's wonderful." Emma's face was alight with excitement. "They said my essay about diversity and inclusion in education was one of the best they'd ever received. They want me to present it at the opening ceremony." "Of course they do," Margaret said, hugging her daughter. "You're going to change the world, sweetheart. I've always known it." Catherine stood and embraced them both. "I've made some calls," she said. "There are going to be some very influential people at that opening ceremony, people who need to hear Emma's message." "You're always making calls," Margaret teased. "It's what I do best," Catherine grinned. "Speaking of which, I have some news of my own." "Oh?" "The Whitmore Foundation is launching a new initiative. We're calling it the Second Chance Scholarship. It's specifically designed for single parents who want to go back to school or start their own businesses, and I want you to help me run it, Maggie." Margaret stared at her friend, momentarily speechless. "Me? Who better? You're living proof that second chances work. You have the credibility, the experience, and the heart for it. Besides," Catherine's eyes twinkled, "I need someone who won't let me get away with anything." Margaret laughed, remembering all the times over the past 2 years when she had pushed back against Catherine's occasionally heavy-handed generosity. "I would be honored," she said finally, "on one condition." "Name it." "We include a mentorship component, pairing scholarship recipients with successful professionals who can guide them, support them, believe in them. Because that's what made the difference for me. Not just the money, but having someone who saw my potential when I couldn't see it myself." Catherine's eyes were suspiciously bright. "Done." They spent the rest of the afternoon planning, dreaming, imagining all the lives they could change. Emma contributed ideas with the same enthusiasm she brought to everything, her young mind already thinking about how to scale their impact globally. As the sun began to set, casting golden light through the windows, Margaret found herself overwhelmed with gratitude for all the unexpected blessings in her life. "Kathy," she said softly. "Yes?" "Thank you for everything, for believing in me, for pushing me, for being my friend when I needed one most." Catherine reached over and took her hand. "Maggie, you've thanked me 100 times, but you need to understand something. You saved me too." "What do you mean?" "When I found you on those steps 2 years ago, I was going through my own crisis. My marriage was struggling, I felt disconnected from my purpose, I had started to wonder if all my philanthropy was just a way of avoiding my own problems. And then there you were, fighting for your daughter with nothing but courage and love. You reminded me why I started doing this work in the first place. You gave me my purpose back. Margaret felt tears sliding down her cheeks. I had no idea. That's because you were too busy surviving to notice. But I noticed, Maggie. I noticed everything. They sat in comfortable silence as the evening settled around them, two women who had found each other at exactly the right moment and had changed each other's lives in ways neither could have predicted. "Mom," Emma appeared in the doorway, "can we order pizza? I'm starving." Margaret laughed, wiping her eyes. "Pizza sounds perfect." As she called in the order, watching Catherine and Emma argue good-naturedly about toppings, Margaret thought about how far she had come since that terrible morning at Westbrook Academy. She had walked into that school feeling like she had nothing to offer. She had been told that she didn't belong, that she wasn't good enough, that her daughter's brilliance didn't matter because her mother couldn't afford the right clothes. But she had refused to accept that verdict. She had stood her ground, fought for her daughter, and in doing so had opened doors to a life she never could have imagined. The pizza arrived, and they gathered around the table, 3 generations of strong women, sharing a meal and making plans for the future. "To second chances," Catherine said, raising her glass of sparkling water. "To second chances," Margaret and Emma echoed. Outside the window, stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky. Somewhere out there, Margaret knew, there were other mothers struggling just like she had struggled, wondering if they would ever be good enough, if their sacrifices would ever be enough. And she made a silent promise to herself and to them. She would spend the rest of her life proving that they were. That appearance didn't determine worth. That poverty didn't diminish value. That every single person deserved to be seen, respected, and given the chance to shine. Because that was the lesson she had learned on the steps of Westbrook Academy, when an old friend had appeared at exactly the right moment and reminded her of what she had forgotten. She was enough. She had always been enough. And now it was her turn to help others remember that too. The night continued with laughter and stories and dreams for the future, and Margaret Chen, seamstress, business owner, mother and advocate, went to bed that night knowing exactly who she was and what she was worth. Not because anyone had given her permission to know it, but because she had finally, after all these years, given herself permission. And that made all the difference.